So this is what I was talking about between the self-deprecation and the self-aggrandizement, right? Where you've got this idea of playing down versus this idea of, elevating something. And this is sort of where we're stuck in the middle as far as artists and being creators is. So it's a reciprocal process. It oscillates back and forth. Sometimes some things take precedent and priority over others. All just sort of depends on your attitude at the time. So I've always worn it, yeah, because it's indicative of a time in my life, which was the transition between, undergrad and graduate school, that I knew I was going to be teaching in the fall, but I didn't want to sell out my roots, right? Because I was also cooking at the same time. I was a short order cook, kitchen manager person. So I'm sitting there for, 8 to 10 hours a day flipping eggs and getting greasy with hash browns and bacon and whatnot. And then when we'd go out at night, I'd put on the suit because I knew that that's what I was going to aspire to be in the fall. And so we called this the summer of ridiculousness because not just because of a lot of goofing around and that sort of thing, but because I think we all knew that it was going to be a transitionary period, not just for my friends, but for me as well, especially with school. And so I went out, I bought a suit for myself, not unlike this one. It was a little charcoal gray number, same color shirt, right? And the skinny tie. but and these were things that just reminded me to sort of stay grounded, because there was this idea that I was this college graduate, and I was going to be this graduate student, and we both know that any sort of the stereotype is you meet any graduate student and they will be sure to tell you about it, right? Because they think they're smarter than everyone else in the room. But in that vein, I sort of wanted to stay sort of grounded, so I went out, I bought the suit, but I also kept things sort of more pragmatic, more in the real world of remembering where I came from, right? So, I've got these greasy clothes at home that I've got, literal grease everywhere. Come home, shower, take the clothes off, put the suit on. And to me, it was sort of like starting the day fresh, And so, you know, those things also sort of, I don't, but I didn't go all in on the suit, right? I didn't, my sleeves don't have cufflinks; they're uncuffed actually, and so my socks are pink, right? So it's the little things that sort of kept me grounded too. It's the haircut, it's those things too that kept me very grounded in not getting lost in this idea that I was going to lose myself with trying to sort of further my education. And so what I ended up doing that summer, I was fortunate enough to go to overseas to the UK to study. And I remember sitting in my room studying because we had a couple graduate students, but the course was a summer course, transfers, uh, which were mostly undergraduate students and younger people. And so at the beginning, I was still quite a bit shy. I'm in a different country. It's the first time I've flown by myself. It's the first time I've done a lot of things by myself. And so what I had to do was just sort of adopt the disguise of somebody who knew what they were doing. And so that's what I did over there. And I remember sitting in the room that I had. It was a pretty tiny room, like this. And I remember sitting there, kind of not unlike a desk like this, and I was reading Ulysses, taking notes, whatnot. And so this was the second time reading through it, and I was like, this is where I need to take my first draft. I need to be more sort of free form with it. I don't need to listen to any of the rules of, this stuffy, narrative format. I don't want to stick to that. I want to be more sort of experimental, not necessarily in that sort of postmodern pretentious sense. But I just sort of wanted to challenge myself when it came to, can I try to make something that I found so interesting and so influential, can I take of that influence and sort of not necessarily borrow it, but sort of transfer some of it into what I was working on. And what transferred was the sort of confidence and the sort of idea that you've got this in Stephen Dedalus in the novel itself, this author slash teacher he's very self-deprecating. He's kind of melancholy. He doesn't know, he's an artist, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. He was the protagonist of that. And he's a struggling young man who just kind of can't find his way in the world. And that's the struggle of the journey, right? And that's kind of what we're going to get to when we talk about this sort of writing process. Is it's always about the narrative journey, and it's always about the struggle of getting from sort of point A to point B, and everything that happens in between there. I mean, that's Ulysses right there in a nutshell. Is a day in the life. And so, like you had asked earlier, this was the second time I read through Ulysses, and I completely destroyed the copy with just notes. The pages were literally falling out and whatnot because of all the notes I'd written. Because I took this during my senior year at college, so this was a year and a half maybe later when I went back to graduate school. And so it's already got a year's worth of notes, and then another year's worth of notes on top of that, just written in a different color pen. And I got through it, and I knew we had to write a paper on it, and I knew the ideas that I wanted to go for it, which eventually turned out to be later on with my further graduate studies. But anyway, so I remember sitting there and I remember finishing it. And if you've read or seen Ulysses, I mean, it's a thick book, right? And so I got through it rather quickly because I spent all of those hours at night just reading through it, keeping mental notes of whatnot. And then I remember when I finished, I finally took out this huge, we had this huge sort of map of Cambridge, where all the things were sort of labeled and listed and blah blah blah. And I mean, it's the size of the desk. And I said to myself, I remember sitting there going, I'm just going to use this to start sort of mapping out these chapters that I've been working on in my head, right? Before I had sort of a shorter narrative where it was, I think it was about, I translated it into a screenplay. So it was only like 35 pages long. I don't know how long screenplays are now. If you're watching some sort of film, I'm sure it's longer than 35. But it was very concise, and I wanted to sort of expand on that with my creative ideas that I was having at the time. And so I just started mapping and outlining and making, and I went through, and I sort of made this column system where I would just write all the way down the paper. Each column was, whatever. And then when I got back to the U.S., I had this giant folded up map that was, I mean, it's 4 feet by 3 feet of the back of a map where I had written the sort of beginnings of these sort of novels that I was working on. Or I didn't have quite the idea of what they were going to be at the end, but I knew the narrative structure. I knew story enough where before I even started rewriting it, I said, this is the beginning, this is the end. This is what's going to happen as far as plot goes. And a lot of people, complain about plot, and they say, well, plot doesn't matter because it's, the what happens doesn't really matter. And I don't think that's necessarily true, because if you're a storyteller or you're claiming to be an author or something like that, you have to have a story there, right? Where I think what they mean is you need to focus on other elements first, whether it's metaphor or characterization or that sort of internal struggle. And I have no problem with making those claims, but to go out and say plot doesn't matter is just sort of a misstep, I guess. So how does this all tie together? You asked me that earlier. And essentially, I mean, it didn't start with the suit, but I mean, I guess that's where we started this journey, right? And I like to tell people that it's sort of like an oscillating odyssey, not to name drop the Joyce again, but it really is. It's, as far as that journey goes with ourselves as writers, not necessarily the story we're telling or the things that we want to write about, but ourselves first as creators, where we need to balance the idea of being the sort of low-key, humble, self-deprecating, sort of almost self-critical, negative person, and the balance with that self-aggrandizement of not just success, but sort of elevating your own standing as far as art goes. And so I don't I don't have a problem with either one, but we have to recognize that there's always going to be a struggle there, no matter how famous you get, how much money you have. Is there a struggle to get back to your roots? Is it there a struggle to get back to where that journey began? And vice versa. Maybe you're struggling a lot with, whether you want readers or you want fans or you want fame or money, whatever. That struggle with staying humble. Maybe you want to forego that and just go for, this idea of, well, if I sell, X, Y, and Z to so and so, they're going to give me a bunch of money. But in that vein, are you sacrificing not just your voice, but your sort of priorities as an artist? But for me, it was very sort of clear cut because not just with reading the Joyce and the experimental fiction that he was working on at the time, but my own sort of struggle as a person, as a teacher, as somebody who wanted to write something not for anybody else necessarily to read. So it's a very sort of selfish thing where I told only a handful of people, I said, I'm not writing for an audience. I'm not writing to get famous or people to come up and want my autograph. I don't care about any of that stuff. I wrote these things for me. I needed to get things off of my chest and out of my mind and onto the paper. If somebody else finds it interesting, good for you. But again, there's that idea of of trying to stay humble with it, right? And so I remember having dinner one time with one of my colleagues, and we were talking about it, and I told him I just flat out didn't want to deal with an editor, and he sort of said, well, that's kind of the process you have to go through. And I said, I don't have to do anything, right? And so through the struggles in the writing and the editing process that I did myself, I wasn't going to bow down to somebody else's suggestions, because to me it was about my journey and my artistic sort of priorities versus somebody else's perspective that I don't really care about, right? Especially if they're just a publisher or an editor or somebody like that. It's not a fan. It's not somebody who's actually read it because they enjoy it. It's somebody who's getting paid to read it, to sort of criticize it and rip it apart and say, well, it could be better because of X, Y, and Z. And it's like, well, you know what? You didn't write the frickin' story, did you? So what you have to say to me doesn't matter. And I remember saying that at that dinner because, and that sort of creative fervor that we had in that moment was just, it sounds really corny, but it was like, I was just so pumped up about it because this colleague of mine was a creative writer and he's a published author, and I think he was just floored. Maybe I'm speaking too much for him, but that I had no regard for the process, for the way that the game was set up, because I just didn't. And so, I didn't go that traditional publishing route because I didn't feel it was necessary for what I wanted to put out into the world.